This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. When you visit the doctor, you probably hand over your insurance, your ID, and contact details. It's just one of the many places that has your personal info. And if any of them accidentally expose it, you could be at risk for identity theft. LifeLock monitors millions of data points a second. If you become a victim, they'll fix it, guaranteed, or your money back. Save up to 40% your first year at lifelock.com/podcast. Terms apply.
¿Hablas español?
Sprichst du Deutsch?
Kan du norsk?
If you used Babbel, you would. Babbel's conversation-based techniques teaches you useful words and phrases to get you speaking quickly about the things you actually talk about in the real world, with lessons handcrafted by over 200 language experts and voiced by real native speakers. Babbel is like having a private tutor in your pocket. Start speaking with Babbel today. Get up to 55% off your Babbel subscription right now at babbel.com/Spotify, spelled BABBEL.com/Spotify. Rules and restrictions may apply.
When I got Tim Mack on the line yesterday, he was getting ready to have something of a slumber party. Tim's a reporter in Ukraine. He founded a news organization called the Counteroffensive. He and his newsroom colleagues were staying up late because the biggest news in Ukraine was about to happen thousands of miles away, in Washington, D.C. It was a meeting between President Trump and Volodymyr Zelensky.
I often think that Americans don't pay as close attention to American politics as Ukrainians do. And for good reason, right? Because the Ukrainians are really very anxious about what's happening next.
This anxiety is hard-earned, to be clear. The last White House meeting between Volodymyr Zelensky and President Trump ended with the president and vice president taking turns berating the Ukrainian leader. And this meeting came on the heels of a summit between President Trump and Russia's Vladimir Putin, a summit in which Trump appeared ready to support slicing off regions of Ukraine to be absorbed by Russia. Full stop. This is not great news, Tim says. But in Ukraine, it isn't unexpected either.
I remember talking to a whole bunch of people who were, let's say, pretty politically connected and asking them, are you guys going to be staying up late at night watching this feed and kind of anticipating what's happening with Putin and Trump? And the response I got is, I'm going to sleep very soundly tonight because I have no expectations of anything good occurring. It's two great powers in the world essentially meeting to carve up a smaller power. I mean, it was and is to the Ukrainians outrageous that this conversation even occurred.
Fast forward to this week. Volodymyr Zelensky boarded a plane to try to fix all this as much as he could. And this time, he brought a few friends to crash the Oval Office party. The prime ministers of Italy and Britain, NATO's Secretary General, the president of France, the chancellor of Germany.
In a normal presidency, all of this would be scripted, negotiations would have done months in advance, and they would know, we might not know, but they would know, the principals would know what is going to happen. In this case, we have no idea. And now the goal is trying to just get Trump a little bit back on the pathway towards understanding that Ukraine needs to maintain its sovereignty and maintains some level of security guarantees so that if the war ends, it will be the last time a war like this is fought on Ukrainian soil.
So is that goal even achievable? Today on the show, Volodymyr Zelensky returns to Washington with his whole posse. I'm Mary Harris. You're listening to What Next? Stick around.
At Emory University, we are guided by a shared purpose and a spirit of collaboration. Students here push each other to think creatively and work together because we believe different perspectives lead to new ideas. We know that Emory's mission to create, preserve, teach, and apply knowledge in the service of humanity takes all of us. We do together better. Learn more at emory.edu.
Since returning to office, President Trump's position on the war in Ukraine has been volatile. Earlier this year, he seemed to align himself with the Kremlin, limiting military aid to Ukraine and browbeating President Zelensky in that notorious Oval Office meeting. That was in February.
You're gambling with World War III. And what you're doing is very disrespectful to the country, this country. That's back to you. Far more than a lot of people said they should have.
Have you said thank you once this entire meeting? No, in this entire meeting.
But as the wars dragged on, President Trump has shown signs of frustration with Vladimir Putin. Trump recently authorized more arms sales for Ukraine via Europe. Then he criticized Russia's bombardment of Ukrainian cities as both disgraceful and disgusting. And in the last week, he moved up a deadline for imposing new sanctions or tariffs unless Putin ended the war. He also raised tariffs on Indian imports to the U.S. to 50%, which was a penalty for India's continued imports of Russian oil. But Tim Mack says, in the days since that Alaska summit, it's become clear. Behind Trump's fire and fury, there has not been much substance.
All of Donald Trump's supposedly pro-Ukraine sentiments have been just vapor. They've been statements, but they haven't been backed by any actions. And that's what I feel the course of the last month or so has been, is that Donald Trump has said some stuff that is marginally pro-Ukrainian. He has urged Vladimir Putin to come to the negotiating table. But then he set a deadline and changed the deadline. And then the deadline has now disappeared. I mean, so he originally set a deadline of dozens of days or there would be secondary sanctions. That was changed to a shorter length of time. Vladimir Putin then went and met with Donald Trump in Alaska, and Donald Trump promptly withdrew his demand for a ceasefire. And now we have no ceasefire, we have no peace deal, and we have no deadline. And no impending, from what I can tell, no impending threat of sanctions. So it really has gone up in smoke.
Yeah, the main thing to come out of this meeting seemed to be this change in position where Donald Trump seemed in favor not of a ceasefire, but a permanent peace agreement between Russia and Ukraine. Why is that important? Why is that difference important?
Yeah, I wouldn't merely characterize it as a change in position. I would say that that's the adoption of the Russian position. The Russian position, it seems to be pretty disingenuous to me. They say that the war will end when they've dealt with all the root causes of the war, and they have a laundry list of reasons that they believe they were forced. And you'll sense the sarcasm in my voice. They were forced to invade Ukraine. These mostly imaginary root causes cannot be addressed. And so what they're trying to do is they're trying to, as much as possible, drive a wedge between Ukraine and what should be Ukraine's closest ally in the United States, and then take advantage of the situation politically.
Is it a play for time? Like essentially drag this out as long as possible so that Russia can grind things out and take more land inch by inch?
That is one of the potential outcomes, right? But all of the potential outcomes in this direction, whether it is some peace deal that's incredibly favorable towards Russia, or a huge break between Europe, Zelensky, and Trump, or the capture of additional territory on the battlefield through a grinded-out method, all of those options are good for Vladimir Putin. And so he's created a strategic direction that favors what he wants to do. Some of them will involve more sacrifices than others, but all of them are good outcomes for Vladimir Putin. None of them are good outcomes for Europe, the United States, or Ukraine. The reason why Ukraine and Europe and Donald Trump until recently were trying to demand a ceasefire as a precondition to peace negotiations is that it would actually show that Putin is serious about negotiating. Putin can continue now to be unserious about negotiating, maybe serious if he gets a ridiculous deal that he can't turn down, but otherwise pursue any sort of action that he wants. And that's why he wanted this. It preserves all of his options while he has to give nothing up in return.
Donald Trump also seemed to now be in favor of Ukraine giving up land that Russia hasn't even taken yet. Also, without NATO membership for Ukraine, which is very important to Ukraine, although Donald Trump has always been opposed to it, I believe. Instead, there's this talk about security guarantees directly from the United States. So instead of having NATO as the people who would come to Ukraine's defense if Russia stepped over the line or tried to take additional land, you would just have the United States intervening. What do you make of this idea?
Well, let's talk about the land component first, and then we can talk about the security guarantees component. It would be a mistake to think of this just as giving up territory or random parts on a map. The particular area that Putin is asking for is this area in Donetsk, which contains a vital fortification line called the Fortress Belt, which has kept Ukraine safe over the last 11 years of war. Him taking this territory is not just a ploy for gaining additional space on a map. It's so that should he want to attack again, should he break his word and launch another invasion in, let's say, a year or 2 or 3, he would be able to do so on the other side of a vital entrenchment line, which has been able to keep the Russians at bay until now. So it's not just a matter of territory, it's a matter of strategic positioning. And so that really does seem to be something that the White House doesn't understand, and which I think the Ukrainians will try to convey. Regarding security guarantees, from the Ukrainian perspective, in 1994, when they gave up their nuclear weapons stockpile, the United States promised to do what it could do to maintain Ukraine's territorial integrity and sovereignty. From the Ukrainian perspective, the Americans have already made a promise to help them, and they haven't kept it, at least not to the extent that the Ukrainians believe they ought to.
It also seems to me like this one-to-one promise of the United States defending Ukraine, it's so reliant on the U.S. keeping its word. And with Donald Trump changing his mind about Ukraine and Putin on again, off again, I don't know what that promise is worth if I'm Ukrainian.
We've seen a lot of these sorts of deals in the past fall through, that if it's not enshrined in law or in treaty and is just a government-to-government agreement, that then if the government changes, it could be swiftly rescinded. You can look at the Iran nuclear deal as one example of that. That these agreements are only enforceable so long as the particular administration that is in power and negotiated it can continue to execute on it. And if Donald Trump makes an agreement today, his successor could decide not to enforce it, or Donald Trump could decide not to enforce it. And so it's really shaky grounds on which to base the future of your country's existence, which is what Ukraine is dealing with right now.
I read from a couple of people this weekend that the conversations between Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump last week seemed reminiscent to them of pre-World War II diplomacy, specifically the 1938 Munich conference between Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain of Britain and Hitler and others, which allowed Germany to maintain control over parts of Czechoslovakia as a part of a policy of appeasement. That's a pretty intense comparison, but I wonder if it rang true in Ukraine.
Well, let's talk about the parallels. What you have in this case is great powers negotiating together without all parties present. It's this view of the world in which those with power can decide what countries with less power ought to accept. And this is a concept that the United States, in many other occasions, on the occasion of other conflicts, has made sure not to repeat.
It seems imperialist.
It absolutely is imperialist. I think that's an absolutely appropriate word for what it is that this involves. I mean, Putin's view is that the greatest disaster of the 20th century was the collapse of the Soviet Union. He believes that Russia ought to have its own sphere of influence in Eastern Europe where they can do whatever they please without Western influence, without Western values, without Western pressure. And what is happening as Russia and the United States talk about the future of Ukraine without Ukraine is that sort of mentality is already filtering through the whole process. It's really damaging the whole process.
When we come back, I check in with Tim one more time to ask, did Volodymyr Zelensky's White House meeting move the needle at all? So, Tim, you and I are talking around 4 o'clock Eastern time, and we've gotten a chance to see a bit of today's White House meetings, first between Donald Trump and Volodymyr Zelensky, then between Zelensky and Trump and a whole collection of European leaders. I've never seen anything like this, where there's this meeting between Trump and Putin, and then it becomes very clear that Volodymyr Zelensky needs to meet with Trump as well. But then all of a sudden, all of these European leaders essentially say, oh, we're going to be plus ones with Volodymyr Zelensky. Did that strike you too?
Well, they want, obviously, to avoid a repeat of the last Oval Office meeting between Zelensky and Trump.
The one where Zelensky was berated.
Absolutely. And they want to just kind of show up in force. You know, there are a number of people who are attending who are known to have a good relationship with Donald Trump in particular. And so I think they're just hoping that with everyone in the room, they can kind of diffuse some of the pressure and get their message across. And let's be honest, I mean, Donald Trump loves the attention. I noticed a Truth Social post that he put up stating with some glee that all these people are coming to the White House to visit him. It just appeals to his vanity.
But as of 5 o'clock yesterday evening, this show of force from Europe had yet to yield anything resembling actual progress on the peace front, at least not in Tim's eyes.
There are no new sanctions that have been announced. At the time that we're speaking, there have been no assurances of security guarantees. There is no ceasefire, and there's no clear pathway to a peace deal. What we have are notions of peace. What we have is kind of vapors of peace. But the United States has not said, we will stand up and back Ukraine in the event of a peace deal. It has not said, we're going to increase our leverage against Russia by imposing sanctions on them, additional sanctions on them. What we've seen is a lot of diplomatic chatter, but not a lot of actual outcomes, substantive outcomes that we can point to and say, okay, they've come up with something.
It's interesting because you said looking at what we've seen so far, you don't see any real breakthroughs. But if I listen to what people around the table are saying, you do have someone like NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte saying Donald Trump's willingness to talk about security guarantees for Ukraine is a breakthrough. Do you think there's anything new here?
Well, I'll believe in the security guarantees when I see evidence of security guarantees. What Trump has said in his typical kind of nebulous way is we'll be involved in some way or something to that effect. He hasn't guaranteed anything. And so it's important as we listen to these leaders and we watch this diplomatic ceremony take place that we not get too caught up in the speeches, and we look at what actions are actually being promised. And I don't hear any actions being promised. Now, it's very possible that I could be severely embarrassed but in the next few hours in which some developments may occur and the Europeans come out and they announce, hey, we have this amazing deal and the Americans are backing us to the hilt. I just don't think that that's Trump's instinct. It's not in his DNA. It's not in MAGA's DNA to do something like this. I think he's reluctant to get involved in European security guarantee. He's spoken a lot about withdrawing troops from Europe, withdrawing troops from their current garrisons in Germany, for example. So the idea that he would engage in new enterprises in Europe, particularly in between two belligerent forces, got me skeptical until I see some actual action.
What comes next in this diplomatic process?
Here's the thing. Just a few weeks ago, it seemed like the Ukrainians, the Europeans, and Trump were all aligned in the same direction. They all wanted a ceasefire as the next step. The second that Donald Trump had a meeting with Vladimir Putin, he dropped the demand. And now no one's talking about a ceasefire. Now we're all talking about a trilateral meeting in which Zelensky and Putin and Trump talk together. It seems the Europeans are in, it seems like the Ukrainians are in, and it seems that Trump has bought into this concept. But we have to wait and see whether the Russians would be willing to take part.
Does Putin want to do that?
Well, meeting with Zelensky would be an acknowledgement of Ukrainian sovereignty. It would be an acknowledgement that they're equals, both the heads of states of countries, and it would put him in the position of needing to substantiate a supposed desire for a peace deal. I'm not sure he wants to do that. I suspect that he'll want to drag this out as long as possible and say that he wants peace while actually taking no actions towards peace. The reason why the Ukrainians, the Europeans, and Trump were proposing a ceasefire as a first step was that it would show, from the Russian perspective, that they were serious about coming to some sort of long-term peace arrangement. They haven't taken that step. What we've seen is that Russia continues its attacks on Ukraine, even over the last 24 hours, even after the Alaska summit between Putin and Trump. And the fighting on the front continues. So we haven't seen any actual actions that indicate that Russia wants peace. I mean, we have to look not at mere words, but what each side is doing.
President Trump did say he was going to speak to President Putin of Russia after his meetings today. He said actually Putin was expecting his call. Do you think that means we're any closer to an end to this war than we were a week ago, a month ago?
I'd love to see it. I think that an end to the war would be a great first step towards justice for all the people who have been traumatized, whose lives have been ruined as a result of the war, to say nothing of the people who've died. But I need to stress that I've seen no actual steps, any concrete steps taken towards peace yet. We're talking about talking at this moment. I mean, Russia has promised in 1994, in the 2000s, in the 2010s, that it would not violate Ukraine's territorial integrity and sovereignty. And it has violated all of those promises and invaded and killed tens of thousands of people, wounded many more, destroyed or disrupted the lives of millions of Ukrainians. And so there's no reason why the Ukrainians would be willing to take the Russian government at its word. The only way it would sign a deal is if it had commitments, rock-solid commitments, for other countries to back it up should the war end, or rather, should it be invaded again. And so that's the only way in which you can imagine the Ukrainians stomaching, or at least tacitly acknowledging the loss of this territory, is if they could get assurances, rock-solid assurances, that they would not get invaded again.
Tim, I'm really grateful for your time. Thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me.
Tim Mak is the editor of the Kyiv-based publication, The Counteroffensive. And that's our show. What Next is produced by Paige, Osburn, Elena, Schwartz, Rob Gunther, Anna Phillips, Madeline, Ducharme, and Ethan Oberman. Ben Richmond is the senior director of podcast operations here at Slate. And I'm Mary Harris. Go find me on Blue Sky. I'm at Mary Harris. Thanks for listening. Catch you back here next time.